This training series is brought to you by a generous grant from Impact 100 and Autism Pensacola.
I wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself at this point because I realize you now know who I am in relationship to Autism Pensacola, but give you a little bit of background about me professionally and personally. I've been working with parents on the IEPs and other special needs concerns since 2002. And for many years I did this as a volunteer and only recently done it as a profession because I'm that passionate and believe in helping others, paying it forward, because I myself have a child with autism. He's about to be 15. And so I, like you, know what it's like to go through the school system process of developing an IEP, getting the diagnosis with the doctor, all of those things that we experience when we hear the word autism for the first time, and all the challenges of raising a child with autism and trying to implement best practices, advocate for your son or daughter. I come out of a teaching background, graduated with an art education degree, taught for over 20 years. And I'm still teaching private lessons, and I'm doing this as well. So I like to keep myself very busy. But I developed IEPs for my students before I had children, and I've worked with many teams before I even had a glimpse of being a parent, much less a parent of a special needs child. So I have the experience and maybe the privilege and blessing of being on both sides of the table as a professional in the district, and it wasn't this district, and also being a parent and sitting at that initial evaluation meeting, being the one of 13 in the room, and I was largely outnumbered and know that intimidating feeling, even though I had been in many of those situations, but as the teacher. So I have maybe a unique perspective in that regard, that I get it. I get it as a parent. I get it from a school perspective for those who are truly passionate and dedicated about what they do. And I believe there's plenty of school personnel that are. I think there's a lot of educating we still need to do. And that's why I do what I do. And I believe in the grassroots effort. So we empower you to empower others and to advocate for your child and maybe improve the school system that way. So a little bit about me, and if you have questions for me later, we can get into that. Let's talk about alphabet soup for a little bit. Here is what you're going to see listed on your IEP. All these terms, all these acronyms. And we did talk a little earlier about PLOP, which is the present levels of performance. And now with 2004, IDA 2004, they've added an extra word in there. They like to complicate. Everything's complicated. Now it's the present levels of educational performance, still called the PLOP though. Go figure. All that is it's going to include everything that your child is doing well or not so well in the education setting. It will also talk about what a typical child at that grade level is expected to, how they're expected to perform, what they're expected to do. Then we talk about goals a lot in IEPs. Goals are basically written for the year, broken down into short-term objectives and benchmarks. You can flip to your child through your child's IEP and see it'll say goal, underneath it'll say objective or short-term benchmark, have all this gobbledygook in it. We're going to talk a lot about that when we have our individual session together. And we'll go through the goals with a fine-tooth comb, see if they match up with your students' needs. See if they match up with the services that are on the service page. So that's why I had you give me a copy of your child's IEP so I can reveal that. Hours, what does hours mean? Hours is basically an explanation of how much of the school day the student will spend participating with children without disabilities in the gen ed setting and other school activities. And that could be school assemblies, that could be art, music, PE, that could be some sort of field trip, if they're going to spend the day at all with a typical peer. Modifications. What are modifications? This is a list of what the student will need in the general education setting. If your student is strictly in the ESC environment, self-contained classroom, you will not see a modifications list because by law they're designed, the ESC classroom is designed to meet all the needs that are listed in the plot, and by definition of an ESC self-contained classroom, they're supposed to be meeting those needs and accommodating throughout the day. But if they're in the gen ed setting, we must list out how each of those teachers are supposed to accommodate the needs of that child in the gen ed setting. It also states when state or district-wide tests are given or an explanation of why these are not appropriate for your student and an alternate assessment is appropriate. It also talks about what modifications or accommodations are needed in order to successfully take these tests. Do they need a small group setting? Do they need one-on-one? Do they need directions read aloud? Do they need extra time? These are some of the things you may see on your student's IEP if they're in the gen ed setting at all during the day. Modifications also include things like if your child has a sensory issue in the classroom, requires some movement in the classroom in order to stay self-regulated, if they need a wiggle cushion to stay focused on their work, if they need frequent breaks, if they need some deep pressure, whatever it takes to keep that student on task and focusing on their schoolwork. When and where. It should say on your IEP when the services will begin, when they will end, and where these services will take place. Then the services and programs. You might see on your IEP the word services, you might see it called programs. It's the same animal. All that means is what special ed and related services that the school will be providing to your student. And I like the new revisions, and every year it seems like Santa Rosa and Escambia revise their IEP format. And I like when they do it in tables and they've got everything lined up in columns and rows. It makes it a lot easier to just kind of pick out all the information you need to have at a glance. And transition services, we talked about that before, that you will see transition services listed on your child's IEP starting at age 12. They become very, very important around age 15. And when your child ages out at 22, we expect them to be fully implemented at that point. This is a list of what the student needs to get ready for after finishing school. And because it's a transition, we start early. We talk about, okay, well, what are we looking at providing for the student in order to function independently, in order to have a job, go to secondary school, college or whatever is on your dream list for your child or their own dream list. And we're working toward that with goals, with objectives, with some sort of interagency communications and plans. So that's the alphabet soup. Now let's talk about where we get bogged down in IEP meetings, and that's usually on writing the goals. And this is where everybody just kind of glazes over. But goal writing can be exciting because this is where we really, really see the needs addressed, is in the goals. Now, when you're thinking about goals and objectives, and again, this is where you are very, very needed in your participation in the IEP meeting. It's important that you participate writing the goals. Even though you may not know how to write them, you know what your student needs. And you'll know if the goal sounds like your student, looks like your student, or if it's just kind of a cookie cutter goal. That part you can certainly be a part of. And when you're thinking about writing goals together, think SMART. And this is an acronym. SMART being specific. Is the goal specific or is it very, very general? Is it measurable? Can we say what we're looking for and how we're going to measure that? Are we using action words? Are there feelings and thoughts in there? Are we using action words to define the goal? Is it realistic and relevant for my student? And is it time limited? Let me give you some examples of this, because I know that's very vague. Let me give you an example of specific, what I mean by specific. SMART IEPs have specific goals and objectives, and they target areas of academic achievement and functional performance, or they should. Let me give you an example. Which one of these sounds specific to you? And I'm just using random names here. Dylan will increase study skills for academic success. This is an actual goal I've seen. Or, Dylan will demonstrate the following study skills: skimming written material and use reference materials in social studies class. The second one. This second one's specific. That's what I mean by it's important to make your goals specific. Where are we wanting to see the goal implemented? What are we measuring? Now, the first example, so he will increase study skills for academic success. Well, what study skills? And in what setting? So we need to be specific, or the goal means nothing. And what I tell teams and parents a lot of times, it's as if I'm a substitute teacher walking into the school. You've handed me Junior's IEP, and I'm the long-term sub, let's say, for 6 weeks. I need to be able to look at that child's IEP and know exactly what I'm supposed to do every day with that child. So that's how I want you to look at your goal writing process and say, if I didn't know this child at all and walked into this classroom and had to teach them today, would this be specific enough for me to know what to do exactly every class? Then the goal should be measurable. I'm going to give you another example of that. And when I mean measurable, I mean they need to have specific measurable outcomes, not how we're monitoring it, but what are the outcomes? Can we measure the outcome? Which of these two goals do you think is measurable and observable? Owen will improve his reading skills. Again, I've seen this on a goal before. Or, given second grade material, Owen will read a passage of text orally at 110 to 130 words per minute with random errors. That is measurable. What are we measuring? Are we measuring that he will improve his reading skills? How can you measure that? Well, we might have taken a benchmark of where he was, but where do we expect him to be? We can't measure where we want him to be if we don't tell what that is. So, while it may sound good, it's really a nothing goal without the measurement in there. All right, IEP goals should use action words. Now, IEP goals include 3 components that must be stated in measurable terms. Direction of behavior, if you want it to increase, decrease, maintain, those are all action words. Area of need, where you want this to happen, reading, math, science, art, music, PE. And then the level of attainment, to what age you want them to reach this goal, with assistance, without assistance, independently, with guidance, how many prompts, that type of thing. So when we're talking about action words, a lot of times I see things like demonstrate understanding. Well, understanding is not necessarily observable. I want to see action words. What are we going to see? What are we going to hear? That's observable. A feeling, or I'll see this a lot. We want so-and-so to demonstrate appropriate social behavior. Well, what is appropriate social behavior? What do you want the child to demonstrate? Tell me. I would like for them to make eye contact, shake hands, and reciprocate in a conversation. That's measurable. That is specific. That is using action words. So I'm going to give you an example. Again, I've seen these on IEPs before. Betsy will decrease her anger in violation of school rules. Okay? Sounds good a little bit, but let's get more action words in there. Provided with anger management strategies and training with adult support, Betsy will be able to remove herself from environments that cause her to lose control of her behavior so that she has no disciplinary notices. Okay, first of all, I love this goal because it states the supports that are going to be in place for this student. A student oftentimes needs to be taught the skill before they can demonstrate the skill, right? So when it says here, provided with anger management training and adult support, love, love, love that. That's so necessary. Then it says what we're expecting her to do to show that she's learned it. She's going to remove herself from the situation, and she's going to modify her behavior with action words. We talked specifically about what we want her to do and what we're going to measure, what's observable. So that's a much more appropriate goal. Then we're talking about goals that need to be realistic and relevant. Well, they shouldn't be based on district criteria or curricula. They should be based on your students' individual needs, their current level of performance. So I'll give you an example of that. Let's say your student is verbal. We want to make sure the goal is relevant to your student's abilities. If the student is not verbal, are we going to ask the student to respond verbally in a goal? That's probably not appropriate, relevant, or realistic for your student. Here's an example. Kelsey will demonstrate improved writing skills. Kelsey will improve her writing and spelling skills so she can write a clear, cohesive, and readable paragraph consisting of at least 3 sentences, including compound and complex sentences that are clearly related. Again, that's very specific. It's got action words in there. But hopefully this is realistic for the child and relevant, obviously. Now we've looked at a goal that includes things for her grade level, expectations for her grade level. And again, like I said earlier, it really depends on your students' abilities, your students' needs. Again, if it doesn't look like your student, doesn't sound like your student, it's probably not relevant for your student or realistic. So you would know best about that. Time limited. If a goal is SMART, it's going to be time limited too. And basically what that means is the duration date of your IEP or another date that you decide that you're going to revisit the goal. Maybe it's the midpoint in the year, maybe it's the end of the 9-week grading period, maybe it's sooner than that. There's going to be a time limit to this, and your goal should state that. It should say per grading period, a lot of times is what you'll see, or per 9 weeks, or report period, whatever it's going to state, has to state that in there. But it should not go beyond a year. I've heard of these 3-year IEPs. Have anybody heard of these? Okay, yeah. It was popular in several states a few years ago. I'm glad to see it's not so popular here, but there are actually IEPs that are written to extend for a 3-year period. That is not necessarily within IDEA parameters, but if a parent gives consent, you can do it. I don't recommend it at all. I think we are dealing with students who are developing, who are constantly progressing, and a year is certainly long enough to come back and monitor the plan and see if we're making progress or non-progress on goals, and hopefully move those benchmarks up a little bit. So I think a 3-year plan is not appropriate for a student who's developing. So that's what it means to have SMART goals. We're at step 7. We had 10 steps, remember, we're getting there. Step 7 is the student begins receiving ESC services. And I'm a very visual, hands-on thinker, so I'm going to have visuals in my presentations always. I love this t-shirt. Do you see what the student's wearing? It says, I am the I in IEP. And I love that because it's so often forgotten that the student is the reason why we're writing this really intensive piece of document, this paper. This is why we're meeting over and over again. This is why we're hashing out things together as a team. It's the individual, and they're worth it. They're worth every bit of it. So that's a little aside about the graphic. So now step 7 is that the student's going to begin actually receiving the services that they were determined eligible for. So now let's say that the IEP has been written and that the team will sign the document. They're ready for you to sign it, and we'll get to that in a minute. The before the services can actually begin, the team needs your written consent. No services will actually start without your consent unless you refuse to give your consent. Then within 30 days they can implement the plan. But the student will then begin receiving services. Let's say you're all in agreement, you've signed the document. That's when your student will start receiving services that day. The parent does not have to sign the IEP at the IEP meeting. Did you know that? I'm sure you were probably not told that at your meeting. I hear that a lot. But they told me I had to sign it before I left. Well, let's get into the specifics of that, because usually there's 2 pieces of paper you have to sign at an IEP meeting. I understand one of our counties is now consolidating that paper into those 2 papers into one, so be aware. There's the participation page that you sign, then there's the consent page. The participation page is simply a list of who was at the meeting. Yes, I was here. Yes, I participated. Doesn't mean you agree with it or disagree with anything that was discussed. It just means you were there. But then there's another piece of paper that they're going to ask you to sign that is consent for the IEP to be implemented. That is the piece of paper that I recommend to parents not to sign at the meeting. Yes. And there's a reason why. First of all, you don't have to sign it at the meeting, but I'm not trying to be adversarial. I'm trying to be wise in that recommendation, because oftentimes these meetings are long, they're exhausting, sometimes confusing or emotional, and it would be wise to spend some time in a calmer, more energetic, relaxed, or whatever environment to review the document. Make sure everything's in there that you discussed. Make sure there's no typos, which I see a lot of those. Make sure that you are in agreement with everything that was put in the document. Go through it. It might raise some questions that you might have for the team before you agree to finalize the document. Take it home with you. Take a draft home with you and say, can I just take this home and read it, look it over, let my spouse look it over, let my mother or whomever is interested in your child's plan, and review it at your leisure when you have a moment to really concentrate on it. Then, if you agree with everything, see no errors, see no omissions, then by all means sign it as quickly as you can and get it back to the school so that services can begin for your student. Now, if you find errors, if you find areas of concern in the IEP, you don't agree with some of the things that are in the IEP, that's when you have a conversation with your ESE liaison, your school administrator, and say, can we maybe meet back and reconvene and discuss some of the concerns I have? And that way you have time to list them out coherently, get your ideas straight about what you want to talk about, go through the plan that they've written up for you, the draft, and maybe highlight some things. Come back to the team and say, can we please discuss this a little bit more? But you have the right to do that. You have the right to take it home with you. You have the right to say, I'm not quite ready to sign this document. And I recommend doing it every time, just because. You'll be surprised what you come up with or find if you take it home with you. Not to be adversarial, but to be thorough, because this is a living, breathing document. It's legal, it's federal, it's binding. You want to make sure it's done right the first time. All right, parents should not sign the IEP if they are not in agreement with the recommendations. They should not sign it if something's missing. And that's a time to get back together with the team. Step 8. Progress is measured over time. All right, this is where you start getting those report cards, progress notes that come every midterm, end of the 9 weeks, whatever your grading period is. And they will be issued as outlined in the IEP on the goals and objectives. So let's say one of your goals says they're going to do it at the end of the year. Well, don't expect to get a progress report till the end of the year. That shouldn't be happening. If it says at the end of the 9-week grading period, that's when you can expect to get your monitored notes, your progress notes. So that would be important for you to know, depending on what is stated as is a time frame in your goal. The IEP must be reviewed to determine progress or non-progress at least once a year. And during the break, we talked about that a little bit, that your IEP should be reviewed once a year at minimum. That's why they call it the annual review. And it's confusing. There's different names for IEP meetings, and that's what that one is. When your IEP is written, you will notice at the top, somewhere at the top of the page, it says duration date. That's basically your IEP's expiration date, and you must develop a new one before that date hits, or agree to amend the IEP for an extension on that date. Let's say that you got sick and you can't meet before it expires or before the duration date comes, and you need to extend the time. You can do that, but I recommend, with steady monitoring of the plan, you might be meeting more than once before that duration date hits. But they must review it with you once a year. An IEP meeting can be called by the school, as you know. It can also be called by you, which is really important to know. If you feel like things are going very well and you've got some input you want to give, though, that's a great time to hold a meeting. If you feel like things are not going well, either with your team or with your students' progress, by all means call a meeting. That's the time to do it. And you might make changes to the IEP, you might not. But if there's important things to discuss, you're well within your right to go ahead and schedule an IEP meeting. It can also be called by any of the other staff or any other interested person that's working with your child, like their grandmother or their neighbor that sees their child and tutors them in the afternoon, these type of team members. And it can be done at any time during the year, and there's no limit on how many times you can meet. You can meet once, you can meet 60 times. I wouldn't, that's just an exaggeration, but you could. But I would not recommend meeting unless you really have a great reason to meet. Give your rationale. Oh, I'm just really concerned about, I noticed his grades are slipping from an A to a C, and I noticed he seems to be needing more prompts at school. You're reporting to me. That's a great time to have a meeting. You need to have a reason. Step 9, the IEP review. We're talking about the annual review at this point. At least once annually, like we discussed, the IEP team must meet to discuss the student's current IEP and develop a new IEP. We're going to do this all over again. And parent involvement is really key in this one. So your document, your child's document, exists for 1 year, unless you amend it along the way. Then you will write a new one for starting that date for the next year. And what you want to consider when you're writing that is all the things we talked about before, plus what you expect them to hopefully gain in skills for the coming year. You have to kind of think ahead. And that's where your team is really vital in helping you, because they're going to have some of that knowledge of, especially academically, what's coming down the pipe. Now, according to IDEA 2004, if the parent and the school-based team both agree on a change to the IEP, then services can be changed without a formal meeting. We talked about that a little bit at the break too, that this is one of the many wonderful revisions of IDEA that I think really, really support the child. So let's say you needed to make one teeny little suggestion or change to the child's plan, but gosh, getting 14 people together at one sitting is very difficult, and I think we're all in agreement. We've been emailing, we agree on this, that they're telling me that they want to do this, I agree with them. Let's just do an amendment. And that's a simple piece of paper. You may have seen it in your IEP. It's called IEP amendment. It's very simple. And all they need is your consent, their agreement. And whatever service that is, let's say, well, we've talked about maybe it would be good to start doing some social skills with Kathy, maybe 30 minutes a week. Well, okay, we all agree on that. Do we really need to assemble the whole team to do that? So then that gets written into the IEP as an amendment, and that goes for a full year. The amendment changes the duration date of the IEP. It now is based on the amended date. Or it could be something very simple like, well, we've realized that Joey does much better at pencil paperwork if he's wearing a weighted vest. Well, that's a simple amendment to the IEP. These are the kind of things I'm talking about. As long as the entire team is in agreement, you can amend the IEP as many times as needed during the school year. All right, step 10 is we're on the reevaluation. This is where we hit all over again that flow chart, that circular chart I was showing you, or the long linear chart where the arrows go right back to the top again. The reevaluation process starts back at the beginning, 3 years from the start date. If you notice on your IEP, and if you have it in front of you, you'll see the duration date on the IEP. You'll see what's called the re-eval date. That is the date 3 years from your last evaluation. And that's when your child is due to have their next set of measurements, assessments done. Now, I'm going to say this about that. That's when they must do it again. Now, if you see a need for your child to be evaluated sooner than that, or if the school sees a need for your child to be evaluated sooner than that, it can happen sooner. And it may not be the full evaluation you had the first time in the initial evaluation with all these, maybe 20 or 30 measurements. It might just be we need to do an OWLS test on them to determine some language needs, or we might need to do a psycho-ed eval, or we might just need to do some DEA testing, or whatever it is to determine what you're trying to get information about, what need you're trying to address. So it could be one evaluation for the re-eval conference, but that should happen within the 3-year period. Wherever the mark is on your IEP, that's where it should happen, or sooner. And that is to determine the progress and the needs and the continued eligibility for your student's plan. Now, reevaluation can be requested by anyone on the team. So let's say you're kind of concerned, you think, well, gosh, he's made so much progress in the area of speech and language. I think some of this data is just really irrelevant now. We need to get a new benchmark for where my child is. If your speech and language teacher agrees with you, if your ESE teacher agrees with you, you don't have to argue it. You've got a referral, and the evaluation will be done. Now, following the reevaluation, you'll go through that whole process again, where a meeting will be scheduled to discuss the results and determine any changes in your child's services, augmentation, relinquishing services, whatever needs to happen there. And that will be to the existing IEP. Now, that was also a meeting where everyone is going to sit around and go over the results. But this time it's not called the eligibility staffing meeting. It's called the reevaluation conference. And again, like I say, there's a lot of terms we have to learn in this whole IEP process, and that's just one of them. So for short, people call it the reeval. You may have heard that. We're going to do our reeval on September 12th, and we need everyone in attendance. That is a really great tool to use to keep your child's plan monitored. If you feel like there's a measurement that you would like to see done on your child, that will change your reevaluation date too. But you can ask for that, your school can ask for that. All right, some final thoughts. We've gone through the whole 10 steps of the IEP process from beginning to end, rolls around again. I would recommend to you to read and read and read some more. There's a lot to learn about this whole process. I threw a lot of information at you today. There's a lot more I could have thrown at you, and I don't want to overwhelm you. But these 2 resources that I shared with you, all about IEPs, and from emotions to advocacy, and this is not in your packet, but I would recommend reading this, the special education law. All these are rights law books. There are many others out there that are wonderful to read, but these are the most parent-friendly, I think. And again, if I got paid for every time I collect their materials, I'd be rich. But I get no kickbacks from it. But just from a parent's perspective and a teacher's perspective, I think they're wonderful resources. Read. Just read. It takes a lot of the anxiety out of this whole process to be informed. I would encourage you to learn your rights. Again, we talked about that procedural safeguards pamphlet that you get at the beginning of every meeting. And I jokingly said I could wallpaper a room with as many as I've gotten, it's true. Read that. It's great, valuable information. Even though it came from the school, it's still the law. I mean, they didn't change anything. They didn't leave anything out. It's good information for you as a parent in a concise form. Again, takes some of the anger, some of the anxiety out of the whole process if you're more informed. I would also encourage you to remember that you are the expert of your child. Please participate, speak up, share. When we talk in 2 weeks, I will be showing you an example of something that a parent put together for their child called a primer. And it's basically an explanation to the school district of what their child does during the day, at home, at school, what kind of behaviors you might see, what their needs are, how they respond to interventions, what interventions you probably wouldn't want to try because it never worked and we tried that. Things like that. That's very helpful to a team. It's a lot of great information where we're not having to trial and error things and waste a lot of time. Get those services honed in. I would also encourage you to speak up at your meetings. You're not supposed to just sit there quietly and listen and nod your head. You're supposed to speak up and contribute, but also ask questions. Again, we went through the alphabet soup list because it's almost like you have to learn a new language in some of these IEPs. And God bless them, but teachers, they're just so used to it, they kind of forget that people don't normally use those words out in society and those acronyms, and so it's very helpful to you to just speak up and say, I'm sorry, could you kind of explain to me what a scaled score is on a measurement and what a raw score is, or just speak up and ask the questions, and they'll be very helpful, hopefully, to explain that to you, and then you're more informed. Then you're getting involved. And make sure you get the answers you ask questions to. Or if you have a concern, ask. Get answers. You have a right to that. And then I would also encourage you to include your child if it's appropriate. Again, that's an individual decision. And I think it goes a long way to show the team that this is why we're here. If a child can participate, it's a wonderful, wonderful way to teach self-advocacy to your child. And then most importantly is to articulate your child's needs to the school. We talked about the primer, but just communicating regularly with the school, because needs will continue to come up, or modifying information you've given previously to the school. Say, well, Skittles were really working to help reinforce this behavior with my child, but now they're really into Thomas the Train. Yeah. So that's the kind of information that you need to keep current with the school system. Now, we talked a little bit at the beginning that this portion of the program for PEP is now kind of morphing into our new program that we're providing through API, which is the Parent Partner Support Program. And we're trying to get together a team, not just of myself, of volunteers to help consult with families who are having questions about their IEP, who need a little bit more support with encouraging them how to partner with their team more effectively, their school-based team, or just need some answers, or just understanding this whole IEP process. We have that now available through API continually through the year. If you're interested, here's our direct link to our program site where you can apply for the program. It is not a free program. However, it is a very generously funded program to where you can get financial aid if you qualify. And it's a $20 application fee. You get signed up for the program. If you qualify for financial aid, it is very generous. So if you have any needs beyond what's provided in this class, we can talk about signing you up for the program. If you know friends or family that could benefit from this program, we encourage you to tell them about it. It's on our website, and it's a brand new program, like I said, but I think it's going to be a wonderful resource for our parents, and we're looking for other people to get involved to help and spread the good and pay it forward.